Welcome, everyone. My name is Billy Borman. I'm the publisher of The Lamp, and I thank you very much for joining us this evening, especially on a Thursday night in Lent. Such nice weather, too. I'd like to start off also by thanking the Institute for Human Ecology and CUA for sponsoring this event. Before I turn things over, I'd like to briefly introduce our two speakers here tonight. Our guest this evening is Volker Leppin, who's a Forrest Tracy Pitkin Professor of Historical Theology at Yale Divinity School, and the author, most recently, of Francis of Assisi, The Life of a Restless Saint. He came to Yale in 2021 after teaching ecclesiastical history for many years in Germany and Switzerland. Our other guest, to whom I will turn things over in a moment, is Matthew Walther. He is the editor of The Lamp magazine, a contributing opinion writer at the New York Times, and he is currently writing a new biography of John Henry Newman for Yale University Press. But with that, I'll turn it over to Matthew.
First of all, I should begin by apologizing if I bear one that slight resemblance to the late Jacques Cousteau. I had a haircutting mishap recently at home, and you really don't want to see what it looks like. So if we began with a prayer, I suppose I'd have to take it off. But anyway, so thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen, Reverend Fathers. I'm afraid that I do not know Professor Leppin's taste in music, so I hope he will not dislike the somewhat labored comparison I'm about to make. But when I think of his writing, for me, the most persistent theme is his emphasis upon the continuity between the world of the late Middle Ages and what we think of as the Reformation. Too often there's a temptation to imagine this sudden rupture, a kind of totalizing social and cultural change, is sudden and all-pervading like an iPhone update. I thought of this recently, actually. I was looking at a woodcut dating from the German Peasants' Rebellion, in which the central figure, presumably a sort of anti-clerical, evangelical revolutionary, preaching the freedom of Christ by rising against temporal authority, is supported from above by the Blessed Virgin. I think of those secret societies in the Black Forest whose members were asked to recite one Pater Noster, one Ave Maria, and one Gloria Patri before they announced their intention of delivering themselves from priestcraft. This is a mental universe that is not impossible, but I think very difficult for us to inhabit now. But which was inhabited by an untold number of actual human beings. And, of course, you can come out entirely on the other end and see Lutheran churches where the faithful receive kneeling at altar rails, a posture that is sometimes dismissed as sinister and reactionary by many Roman Catholic prelates, including in this country. Another persistent error, I think, is to imagine this fantastic twilight period as some kind of binary conflict in which these vaguely defined forces like reform or humanism, understood monolithically, are pitted against the old established tyranny of scholastic metaphysics. Here I hope you'll indulge me in a longish quotation from an author who's now better remembered for his stories about talking beavers, but who also wrote what I think is probably one of the 5 or so best works of literary criticism from the last century. Here again, we must beware of false simplifications. Humanists were seldom, even by accident, allied with scientists. Scientists did not always despise scholasticism. Aristotle and scholasticism are sometimes in opposition, In reality, the humanist revolt against medieval philosophy was not entirely a philosophical revolt. Theirs, he says, are not the terms in which a new philosophy attacks an old one. They are unmistakably the terms in which, at all times, the merely literary man, the belletrist, attacks philosophy itself. No humanist is now remembered as a philosopher. They jeer and do not refute. The schoolmen advanced and supported propositions about things. The humanist replied that his words were inelegant. Luther himself would no doubt have nodded along with Erasmus when he said of the followers of St. Thomas, "The more filthy barbarism they have in their style, the greater theologians they do account themselves." Or with Wessel Gansfort, who said, "Call ye Thomas Aquinas a doctor? He knew no tongue but the Latin, and barely that." But who now thinks of Luther as a prim literary man, concerned above all with the purity of style, in comparison with Erasmus or even with the Thomas More of Utopia, whose inhabitants find St. Thomas's conception of second intentionality incomprehensible? These kinds of important distinctions, I think, can be brought home analytically in a closely argued chapter or essay, but they can also be expressed fantastically in mythic terms, even by non-historians. I realize I've left Professor Leppin in suspense. Don't worry, I'm not about to say that the themes of his work are driven home to me by Taylor Swift. I can't sing, nor am I sure enough sharing the stage with a native speaker of my German pronunciation. So instead, I will give you the facing page English version from my copy of the libretto of Act 3 of Die Meistersinger by Wagner. "Awake, the dawn is drawing near. I hear a blissful nightingale singing in the green grove. Its voice rings through hill and valley. Night is sinking in the west. The day arises in the east. The ardent red glow of morning approaches through the gloomy clouds." This seems to me essentially medieval in its simplicity, and certainly that was the effect, I think, for which Wagner was striving. Its pre-romantic lack of adornment, its attentiveness to things in themselves. In this world, this twilight in-between world of reform and possibility, but also very much what we would think of in a familiar sense as the cozy sense as the medieval world, is one that Wagner very much makes alive. And here I'm reminded of what Gilbert Ryle said in a very different context. A myth is, of course, not a fairy story. It is the presentation of facts belonging to one category in the idioms appropriate to another. To explode a myth is accordingly not to deny the facts, but to reallocate them. I, for one, am very interested in the prospects for this kind of approach to historical writing, and in particular this kind of approach to the writing of biography, in particular of the biography of figures whom we recognize as canonized saints, a middle way between what you could call, without intending to be pejorative, naive hagiography and iconographic traditions on the one hand, and recklessly ideological debunking exercises on the other. And that, I think, with his new study of St. Francis, is what Professor Leppin has achieved. And so, and now I turn things over to him.
Thank you so much. I will take that mic. So thank you very much for this introduction that resonates very much with how I want to be understood. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you. So very much for inviting a Lutheran who has written about St. Francis. I apologize for that. So it is clear it is not hagiographic because I'm a Lutheran, but as you said, I also didn't try to debunk what we know about Saint Francis, but to find a way in which we deal with our conceptions of Saint Francis and try to look at what we know from the sources as far as we do know something about him. So there we are, and there we are with another famous Francis, of course, who in all his pontificate related to Saint Francis and to a certain concept of Saint Francis. That's important for our understanding ecumenically in our days. Still, it is something where we find he deals with Francis, of course, in a kind of useful way. He deals with what we know from Francis. I won't quote the entire text of the Canticle of the Sun. I only find it interesting that this Canticle of the Sun ends with some verses about the judgment, about the human beings. When Pope Francis quoted this Canticle of the Sun, he skipped these verses. He just wanted to have the ecological Saint Francis, and of course, that resonates with what I also want to have as a historian. I have to say, all right, there are those verses which do not resonate so much with what we want to say nowadays. However, this is a text from the hand of Saint Francis, so we can interpret it and we can have a kind of voice of Saint Francis that is a kind of starting point. Then it becomes much more complicated when I look into the history of hagiographic writing about Saint Francis, or all of us refer in the end to the Vita written by Saint Bonaventure, and which was preceded by a good number of writings, all in the process of hagiographic writing, starting with Thomas of Celano, who, to support the canonization of Saint Francis, wrote his biography of Saint Francis. And there the problems start. How do we deal with a writing like this? Thomas of Celano knew Saint Francis. He was close to him, so he knew a lot about him. So he's a good source. On the other hand, writing to support a canonization, that's like you go to a funeral and you hear something about the person whom you might have known in a different way than you now hear the funeral. Of course, we only say good things about those who are deceased. That's what happens here. So some problems start already there, and they don't get easier when we look to all those biographies. I don't want to mention them all, just to give you an impression. All biographies that were written in the first years after the death of Saint Francis, and then the order asked to collect even more knowledge about Saint Francis. So other biographies, other vitae were written, among them again Thomas of Celano, who revised his earlier version of Vita. He made a new approach. Did he know better now, 20 years later? Or did he elaborate in a more refined way now, 20 years later? I will have a look at an example to ask right this. And if we look at how Thomas of Celano wrote about the youth of Saint Francis, in his first biography of Saint Francis, he wrote about all those problems. A young man raises, he had a gang around him, he was a leader of a gang, and the only thing that connects the youth of Saint Francis with the later Saint Francis was that he was so charismatic, that he had friends, but in his youth he had the wrong friends, and later on he would have the right friends. 20 years later, he writes, Saint Francis from the beginning was a kind of sacred person. So who now is right? Thomas of Celano 1, or Thomas of Celano 2? We don't know. We have to deal with it, and we have to find arguments. That's what I tried in this biography when I tried to find some arguments. Of course, one argument to deal with, which source can I trust, is the age of a source. The closer to Francis, the more we might think it is plausible what this biography writes. because a simple argument, when Tommaso of Celano wrote his biography a few years after the death of St. Francis, there were still many, many people who knew the stories and who knew St. Francis, so you could not lie too obviously in a biography like that. Still, as I said, he might have, through collection, through talks with others, have known better later. On the other hand, you have to look at the bias in the sources. A bias, of course, is when I try to support a canonization. So I have to ask, is this written just because you want to have the saint in Sacred Francis, or is there some historical stuff in it? So a good test case is a story in the life of St. Francis, which is witnessed by non-Franciscan authors. This is his encounter with the Sultan, the very famous story when he was with the Crusaders in Egypt and they entered the camp of the Muslim side. But still, we have, again, I will not go into too much details. We have different reports and we have some problems about this story. How was it possible that Francis came into the camp of the Sultan? We have different reports what he said to the guardians of the camp. In some reports, he explained what he wanted to do. In other reports, he only shouted, "Sultan, Sultan." Well, I believe this version is right, because he didn't know any Arabic. And the guardians, I guess, didn't know Italian, and they didn't know Latin, which also causes some more problems when he later on would meet the Sultan himself. They needed some translators, of course. And there, people might have thought he is either an ambassador or a spy, and brought him to the Sultan, and there he tried to convince the Sultan to convert the Sultan, even to Christianity. However, using translators there. And then in the end, he was released from the Sultan, a very surprising fact. Hagiographically, people would say he was so convincing and the Sultan understood he's a peaceful person. A more historical view would say the Sultan thought this man is somehow crazy, and so he's not dangerous, and we can release him. So this is even a story reported by non-Franciscans, reported by people who are not so much biased like Tommaso of Celano is, but still it causes many problems. Much more clear are biases in all those stories in which, in different layers of biographies, these biographies say something like St. Francis tried to rebuild the church. This is the story when he encountered the the crucifix in San Damiano. The crucifix told him, "Rebuild my church." And he understood it in the way he had to take some stones and help and to reconstruct this church of San Damiano. Only later he understood he had to rebuild the Church of Jesus Christ in general. That's, of course, a theological understanding. And now it comes the way between alternatives are how to deal with it. To say this is not historically true in the sense that this happened from the beginning, including the famous dream of Pope Innocent. There might have never been this encounter, this voice of the crucifix telling him, rebuild my church. But the theological truth might still be in it. And that's, I think, something we have to take in account. When evaluating what is historically true, I take another argument into what is historically plausible in a certain situation. Again, coming to the understanding Pope Francis has of Saint Francis as a peacemaker. That's, of course, something which resonates very much with our understanding nowadays, and refers to his talk with the Sultan. Historically, we have to say, now I have some data here, I summarize quite quickly. We have to say Saint Francis was a part of the crusade, historically. So what he did was not peacemaking in a sense we nowadays would understand peacemaking, listening to both sides, but it was peacemaking by bringing the gospel to the Muslims. So if we, like we do nowadays, take Francis as an example for interreligious dialogue, we have to think we do maybe a different thing to what he did. Plausible in a context in which someone was in the camp of the Crusaders is he tried to help the Crusaders to gain the goals they had to make the Orient a Christian world. And in the end, yes, the argument, what can I find historically in St. Francis, is what remains as a kind of individual trace in the reports about him. I would say the most individual trace is his conflict with his father. His conflict with his father. That is right at the core of my understanding of St. Francis, that he broke with his father about the understanding of wealth, about, to put it this way, about capitalism and how we Christians would deal with what we have as money, and that he found a new kind of father in the bishop and of Assisi and in the Pope. That explains a little bit why St. Francis, as someone who criticized the society in his time, still was a part of the church of his time and obedient to the Pope. Just giving one example of the difference of generations, we see, of course, the father of St. Francis was someone supporting the poor. Actually, I wrote this book as a father of 4 kids, and I wanted to understand the father of St. Francis, who is not very well received in the biographies of St. Francis. And to understand him is he really wanted to give his money to the poor. He did so. But what Francis then did was that he said, it is not enough to only give money to the poor, to send it through a messenger. But what he did was going to the poor, going to the lepers, going to the sick, embracing them and kissing them. That's loving your neighbor, he said, not only giving money. And that's in the core of the conflict with his father. Do you go into distance to those whom you help, or do you really go into their presence? That's what I tried to find out in my book about St. Francis. And so I'm very interested now in have a talk how to write books like that.
So, one thing that you see in projects like Professor Leppin's is this approach to biography that I've always thought of in my head as deep focus biography. For anyone here who's familiar with the history of photography or of cinema, deep focus is just when you have such a large depth of field that objects in the foreground and in the background appear equally in focus. A classic example of this in a movie is Greg Toland, the cinematographer for Citizen Kane. In images like the one where we see Mr. and Mrs. Kane and old Mr. Thatcher, the future guardian, and young Charles himself clutching the sled that we do not yet realize is both the prosaic answer to Thompson, the journalist's queries, and the symbolic key to the film. It's all there at once. It's all equally in focus. We're taking it all in. The prosaic material, the symbolic material. In some books, like I think if you think of something like Kantorowicz's biography of Frederick II, you see rumors and legends and prophecies, intermingling with the deposits of archives. And one sort of assumes that whatever their factual status, these memories or these images or these ways of understanding a figure like Frederick II, or in this case, a figure like Francis of Assisi, in these roles as peacemaker or as someone who has something to say about what we would now think of as ecology, are simply part of what history has bequeathed to us, and they are not or should not be presented naively, but they're also not breathlessly debunked, thrown away as if useless. So I think what's interesting, though, here in the case of Francis of Assisi, if I compare it with my own experience working on a biography of someone like Saint John Henry Newman, who lived in a much later period, what one would call naive or hagiographic tradition still springs up just as quickly. But because we have so many more documents, especially primary source documents, it is easier to assess these things. A great example, something that appears in so many obituaries and early biographical sketches of Newman, is this notion that when he was a child, he was a playmate of the young Benjamin Disraeli, the future prime minister. But not only was this not true, it was impossible for reasons of age, because Newman was away at school and then gone to Oxford by the time the Disraelis were in the neighborhood. But more importantly, because they interacted many times later in life and cordially despised one another. In fact, at one point, Disraeli said that after refusing to, coming up with an excuse not to meet Newman, he had written that Newman had brought religious questions into the hands of monks and schoolmen, and that Newman's secession dealt a blow to the Church of England under which it still reels. But anyway, these kinds of examples could be multiplied infinitely. But I'm curious to ask Professor Leppin what is the difference between this kind of undertaking when you're dealing with sources that are much more recent and those posed by a figure like Francis of Assisi?
So, of course, as you mentioned, we don't have this amount of sources as we have in modern times. We have this amount of biographies, as I mentioned, but from the time of St. Francis himself, there are so few sources left. That's the first thing that makes it so difficult. The other thing is that what I more and more learned when dealing with St. Francis is that the sources have a certain understanding of the world, a worldview that is different to our view, which I still want to respect when it comes to miracles. I wouldn't take the stance to say, as a modern human being, there's a miracle, we cannot believe in a miracle. But I touch a world in which a miracle could happen. And even if I would explain what happened there with some explanations from natural sciences, I have to respect, for those people witnessing St. Francis, this was really a miracle. And that was, taking your example of Cardinal Newman, he lived in a time when you already had criticism of miracles, when you had established modern natural sciences. So understanding of miracles was in distance to a kind of common sense. That was not the case, say, in the 13th century.
So touching that, I mean, I think what is interesting to me here is just well, looking around the room, how many people here have ever read one of the medieval lives of Saint Francis? How many people here have seen a picture of Saint Francis? How many people here have sought the intercession of Saint Francis in prayer? So I think that's a remarkable thing in itself, and it points to a very tricky balancing act for anyone who wants to undertake uh, a biography here, because the cultural and spiritual significance of Saint Francis, in a sense, is something which you could say almost does not require explanation, because it's something that continues to live and is known to people in their ordinary lives with their pictures and their prayers and so on. But to show how we got there requires a certain sensitivity and intelligence that I think, again, requires us to chart this middle way between, well, I mean, in a way, given the discrepancies that exist even in the comparatively recent, accounts that we have, it's not even as if you could just stack them on top of each other. Even a prospective historian or a biographer operating at, again, I keep slipping into these accidental pejoratives. I don't want to say the most credulous, but the someone operating with the least degree of skepticism would still have to either explicitly or implicitly decide between different accounts, and he could just do it silently and present this material and not that material, or he could say, this account says this account says that. You can make it up for, you can decide for yourself. But even that is still essentially a kind of critical judgment. So on the one hand, there's this kind of maximalist sort of golden legend approach to the writing of saints' lives. And then I like to think that, at the opposite end of the continuum, you have, well, who here is familiar with that wonderful 18th century compendium, Butler's Lives of the Saints? So, maybe you already know then. If you buy, a copy of Butler's Lives of the Saints on Amazon or whatever, it's probably not the edition that you want, at least if you're seeking sort of edification, because Butler's Lives of the Saints were revised heavily in the 20th century by two successive waves of scholars, but the most significant was the first wave. It was a Jesuit called Father Herbert Thurston, who thought it was sort of his bounden duty, because his hobby was exposing the frauds of people involved in mesmerism and spiritualism and all that sort of thing, all those sorts of things that were very popular at the turn of the last century, sort of ipso facto to discount anything that even sort of remotely smacked of the miraculous in the lives of any saints, apart from, maybe the apostles themselves. And that seems to me, in a way, even more crude and naive than simply in a mechanical way heaping up all the accumulated testimony of previous ages. What do you think, especially about the question of the miraculous, which you kind of alluded to earlier? How, what should be sort of the attitude of the serious, critical historian?
You spoke about a kind of alternative between just making a decision without telling, or just adding one account to the other and let the reader decide. What I try to do is a middle way to present the sources and to explain my decision in any case. I think that's, I understand myself as a historian being fair with my reader doing this, so my reader knows why I decide this way. And I give the arguments at the hand to criticize my decision. That's how it can work. The most difficult thing in this is still to have a kind of story of about Saint Francis. I believe it worked out, and I'm very thankful to my translator. This book was originally written in German and translated by Riz Bazant, who I think still made a readable book, even if sometimes an argument would cover 2 or even 3 pages until I say, well, the most plausible way to put it is this one. But never I do the thing that I say, we are pretty sure it is like this. I think we cannot do this, in particular with a person like St. Francis, but also in many other kinds. I have written a biography of Martin Luther, and there we have much more source material, but the same is true. We have biased sources. So still we have to question a lot in this case. And I think that is what we have to do as biographers, present the problems and still present the story.
Yeah, I think that is maybe where the analytical impulse, I think, becomes most difficult, is in trying to have a narrative, a readable narrative, a book that someone can sort of sit and put his feet on the fender and enjoy. You don't want to bog it down with too much explanation. At a certain point, you just want to be able to say, this is what happened, or this is what I'm pretty sure happened, or this is what most people think happened. Balancing those requirements with a sense of, scrupulous honesty, I think is a difficulty that all biographers have to meet one way or the other. Again, I'm smiling, thinking again of, do you know Kantorowicz's Frederick II, where he's happy just to say that that there was this prophecy and so on, and his tone makes it clear that he doesn't really think that most of his readers at that time believe these prophecies, but he's throwing them out there to achieve some kind of evocative effect. Anyway, I think with that, we're happy to take a couple questions here.
Thank you very much for the conversation. I was sort of wondering, when you're writing a biography, Obviously, Saint Francis was, a man of his time, and you have to explain sort of the context for that. How do you sort of, what do you think is sort of the best way to do that in that not it doesn't bog down the narrative, but you also get a sense of what he did in the world he lived and how he sort of thought.
Of course, you usually start with sketching his time a little bit, but as you say, if I start with 50 pages telling, look, society was like this or like that, then people will start asking, and what about Francis? I wanted to know about Francis. So then throughout the book, I tried to give a sense of the time. My background is a historian of theology and spirituality, so I give some hints to social history, but what I basically try to explain throughout the book is the mentality of the time. So it goes up to the end when it comes to the stigmatization of Saint Francis. I think a little bit about what a vision in Middle Ages could mean, because my understanding is there was no physical stigmatization, but there was a vision received by Elias of Cortona and others who saw this man really was the second Christ. And then I have to run it, or I have to explain to people in our time, when I talk about visions in the Middle Ages, this is not like in the 21st century when we say, oh, it's only a vision. It's not reality. In the Middle Ages, it is the other way around. If you have a vision, it is a God-given vision, so people understood that is what God wants to show us. That's still an explanation of mentality in the Middle Ages in the end of the book. So that's what I try to have a heavy part at the beginning and then to have some spots throughout the book.
Thank you for both for your remarks. Professor Leppin, this is for you specifically. I'm curious in assessing your sources. You have lots of primary sources to whom you're applying source criticism, and then you have modern literature that you read. At what point, when you're reading through the commentary or the biography of Saint Francis, do you begin to recognize practitioners of your own profession? Is it with the Bollandists, and what do you see? At what point does it start to look like they're not hagiographers and they're trying to get to the truth of whatever historical nut there is at the bottom of it?
Usually we start to say that modern research on St. Francis starts around 1900, which is quite late. It starts with Paul Sabatier, another Protestant, actually, since whom we speak about the Franciscan question. So he was the one who said we cannot have any more Bonaventure's biography as the default model of writing the biography. He was the one who presented all the material, starting with Thomas of Celano, who said we have to read the Testament of St. Francis really as a witness of his biography. So it is not much more than 100 years that we have this kind of critical research. That also means that came later than critical research on Jesus Christ. You have all this research on Jesus Christ since the 18th century even. Then Gramaros wrote about him. And this research on Jesus Christ, to a certain degree, shaped the questions that were later on posed to St. Francis or to the tradition of St. Francis. So that's how I would put the kind of research history.
Thank you for this. I think the American answer to the hagiography question was like ever since in the last 30 years or so to try to do really, really, really intimate personal biographies. And like ever since McCullough's John Adams, like you see a lot of their personal emotional lives way more than ever before that, almost as if like they're kind of quasi-psychologizing them and writing a novel about them. And I'm wondering to what degree you think that's appropriate for serious biographies versus to what degree that kind of does an inverse kind of TV age hagiography, and especially with the saints, right, who we all know have really deep inward personal lives. So what degree is that something that biographers should be doing versus the context of their times and their achievements?
So it's a German sitting here on the stage. The German approach, of course, is much more distancing oneself. I would not say that the other approach, like you describe it, is not a possible or a serious one. I would only like to maybe even compartmentalize my distant approach, really to reconstruct what I find in those lives of Saint Francis. And then on another level, and that's still important to me because I'm not only a historian, I'm a theologian as well, on another level, to say what can we still find as personally intriguing from this person, Saint Francis, in the way we have reconstructed him. So I would put the personal approach in the end, still being aware of the fact that when starting to write about Saint Francis, there must be something intriguing in him. There is some personal touch in me, but that's more something I'd deal self-critically with, telling myself, be careful, don't read into Saint Francis what you would like to find there.
To that, I would just add that it's a very interesting question, especially if you're thinking about biography as practiced in the Anglosphere, going back to, say, Boswell's Life of Johnson or to John Aubrey's Brief Lives, where we can see the beginning of this this discipline, at least as it's recognizable to me. I would say that I am probably, speaking not as a German, a bit more sympathetic to that kind of approach, especially when, I think especially it's much easier to write, to get away with, or to justify writing a somewhat more idiosyncratic book, or a book that takes certain risks in the interest of achieving certain narrative effects, or eliciting certain kinds of emotional responses, when you know there's beneath it, there's a sort of steady bedrock, either of much more kind of sober and careful biographies, or at least of widely available, edited primary sources that anyone can access. And I think in the case of my own book about Newman, on the one hand, I've approached it very much under the assumption that the most widely known biography of Newman, the one that's still in print, that's hailed as a great masterpiece by the late Father Ian Carr, is very much unlike that. It's a very dry, reserved, critical biography that is trying to analyze Newman's published works, especially his mature published works. And it's a book that doesn't necessarily have a strong narrative thrust. It's also a book that does not give you much of a sense of what Newman's world was like, or all the characters he's interacting with over the course of this long life that essentially spans the whole of the 19th century. Carr's book, Newman has failed his examinations, but somehow managed to land a fellowship at Oriel College anyway, by, I want to say, page 12 in Carr, which is about, it's like 800 pages long or something. In my book, provisionally, I think, Newman is still anxiously preparing for his examinations on page 75. And yet somehow my book is going to be, half or 2/3 the length of Cars. So we'll see how it goes.
Thank you both for your remarks. The threading the needle of the historiography or the historiographical approach brought me to mind of Carlos Ayer's work, his more recent They Flew, which is on my to-be-read pile. So, but I was curious if this is something new in the discipline, to instead of a total deconstruction or a hagiography, is this something unique to being at Yale? Just wondering if you could comment on where the discipline is at this point.
Interesting point. So when I got this book from Carlos Ayer on my desk and in my hands, I was just excited about it. It's a great book, and indeed it resonates with what I did with St. Francis. The interesting point is Carlos Ayer, even if being Catholic very deep in his heart, officially is a secular historian, while I'm officially at a divinity school. But what we do, of course, resonates very much, and Carlos Ayer more programmatically than I spoke about this history of the impossible, spoke about something crossing natural laws. So maybe we are at a point in the historiography where we are more honest with our foreparents and to accept that they had a different worldview. And I would be glad if at Yale, not only at Yale, but also at other places, people would follow these traces and say, yes, let's have respect for what in other times was possible and was believed.
That's a very good and astute question, and it we've just been at sort of 20,000 feet cruising altitude about the sort of meta theory of biography. So to go all the way down to the hard facts, one of the things about publishing books that tends to be invisible even to most sophisticated readers of serious books is that real people decide, I would like to publish this book, I would like to edit this book, and by a strange coincidence, Carlos Ayer, Professor Leppin with this book, and my forthcoming Newman, we all have the same editor at Yale University Press, the marvelous Jennifer Banks, who I think is the greatest book editor working in America now. Of course, I would say that she has to take me on, but there are, that is to say, I think in a broader sense outside Yale, in the sense of the university or the university press even, there are certain commonalities and currents, but also sometimes things start small in very particular places and work their way outward. Maybe one more question, otherwise we can.
Hello, thanks for coming. What I was curious about is what kind of Francis you're hoping or wanting or expecting to find once you sift through the partial takes that you get from Bonaventure and Celano and et cetera, because it is important to consider that regardless of whether, he received the stigmata or other things like that seem kind of like romanticized stories that maybe only people that knew him and truly loved him would tell, it still reveals that whether or not these things happen literally, he was obviously a good and revered man. So I guess, yeah, just going back to what I said originally, like what would you be hoping to find if you could get literal, more impartial takes on Francis? More of his human side, or I guess, I don't know if I really articulated that question well, but yeah.
So you see, if I got it right, so I understand. If I could know more, what did I want to know about Francis? Is it right?
Yeah. Like,
Yep.
What's the objective? Because okay, thanks. Because you spoke about how all these takes can kind of be biased, and it was 800 years ago. What's the mission in trying to get a more objective take that's not a take that's for the purpose of his canonization, hagiographical and such? What is your goal in getting a more objective, literal take of his life?
So what I'm wondering about it is, how was it possible that a person did not totally abandon the tradition he grew up in, the Christian church? He was always bound to the Christian church as it was in his time, in contrast to Peter Walters, to the Catharians. He stick to the church. How this was possible, while on the other hand, he was so much attacking his time. He was so much confident that he had a call that brought him into distance to the common Christianity of his time. So I try to understand what made him so bold, so convinced, and what made him, on the other hand, so able to take up what he found in his time. So how can someone emerge as bringing new in a way that it does not totally break with what was there before? That's my question to him, and maybe that's a question I have to the other authors whom I wrote biographies about. That's, as I mentioned, Martin Luther, whom I also understand as someone who tried to preserve much more from tradition as most people think him to have done. And it is also the case in William of Ockham, whom I wrote a biography about, who was called the Venerabilis in chapter, the great beginner. And I would also say he still took up more from his predecessors than most people would say. So this understanding of, as you introduced at the beginning, of continuity and newness, that's what I'm interested in. Did I get your question?
All right. Well, thank you all again so much for coming.